Nick, first question is for you. You've tweeted recently about Black Lives Matter, and you actually also had a tweet directed at white leaders. You said we need to remove the stigma that speaking against injustice is somehow a liberal gospel and reclaim the gospel that cares for people's present plus eternal suffering. Why did you post that? What was going on with you, and why did you feel the need to post that?
Yeah, well, obviously, I don't understand all the complexities and the history that have happened in the church in America, but I do know that for those that are older leaders, and I think those that are maybe 40 and up, 50 and up, I'm in my 30s, but there is this kind of understanding and stigma that when you start to get involved in social causes, people will use this term of, oh, that's the social gospel. In other words, they feel like it is at the exclusion of talking about eternity and salvation. It's not the Billy Graham type. I mean, you think of Billy Graham and Dr. King, and Dr. King is the social gospel. Billy Graham is more the gospel, as what I think a lot of evangelicals, and specifically white evangelicals, would feel. Now, I think what I've understood is that for the Black church and for people of color, it has never been an option of whether or not to speak against injustice and suffering, because that's where their people are. And so I think it has been a luxury that we as white leaders have been able to give a gospel without having to confront the issues of systemic racism and discrimination. And I just think it's time for the church to unite as one body, to give the whole gospel, to share that Jesus cares about people where they are, whether they're hungry, whether they're sick, whether they're being marginalized, and he definitely cares about their eternity. And so, I mean, it's like we care about all suffering, especially eternal suffering. But man, for you to share the gospel with me and tell me that it's good news without confronting the bad news of this broken world, to me makes me feel like you're not sharing good news at all. That's not Jesus. I don't see that in the gospel. And so I just would say we need to stop using these separations and say, there is one gospel. This gospel is a gospel of Jesus, who shows us what it looks like to confront the evils of our day while pointing us to the kingdom that is coming. And so it's not an either or, it has to be a both and.
I'm curious to know what response you've received in relation to tweeting about Black Lives Matter, and what pushback have you gotten, or what's been the response from white evangelicals, white leaders?
Yeah, well, I think people hear that, and again, they think it's liberal, or they think it's, going off on a tangent. Certainly there is valid concern about when you say Black Lives Matter, people want to associate with the movement Black Lives Matter, which organizationally has a lot of stances that I don't agree with, but I can agree with the movement in that Black lives do matter. And what I'm trying to clarify, and what I think a lot of men, women, preachers, ministers are trying to clarify, is that nobody is saying Black lives matter more. Like, Black people aren't even trying to say that. Our friends aren't even trying to say that. People are just saying that these lives matter. And so a lot of times people hear that and they think, yeah, but all lives matter. But, and I even saw a meme today about Jesus with the Sermon on the Mount when he says, blessed are the poor. And then somebody's saying, yeah, but Jesus, blessed are all people, and it's like, you don't need to clarify. Like, obviously people are blessed. Obviously God loves all people. That's obvious. But what isn't obvious is that Black lives matter, in that there is a history of racism and discrimination that we have to confront. And it's the history of America. It's the original sin of our country. When you think about slavery, when you think about, gentrification, when you think about education, when you think about, in unjust scales and unlevel playing fields. And it's just like, we all need to raise our voice and say, man, Black lives, these lives matter. It is not okay that this happens while we are alive. Whether you caused this problem or whether you inherited this problem, man, it is not a choice for us to turn a blind eye and pretend that this isn't happening. And so I just think it's time to raise our voice, And this is a gospel issue.
At the end of the day, it's really about, compassion, having compassion for people, having a compassion for community. And that's not to, first of all, we don't, as human beings, we shouldn't dismiss any kind of murder. The murder of George Floyd has just been so illuminated. Of course, people are murdered every day in many different ways. And this is not it's not a comparison. We shouldn't be comparing, but the murder of George Floyd has been illuminated. This murder was on national television, broad daylight, with bystanders with cameras that were pleading for a man's life, in which a police officer just had no regard for human life or even for the humanity of people who were pleading for his life. So the response to that, is that it's a human issue, and some murders are more illuminated and require more national attention, but it's not to degrade or devalue the life of anyone else. This just happens to be a situation where millions of people bared witness to it, and it pulled the heartstrings of many, because this wasn't a situation where cameras was not rolling, and we didn't know the details and particulars of what took place. Of course, an investigation is needed, but we had enough information right there on our very eyes to make some human basic determinations of immediate action that needed to take place. And I think because of the murder of George Floyd was so illuminated is because of the things that we're coming off of. First of all, we're in a pandemic where you have communities of color who are really struggling from a health standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a housing standpoint. And then, we just had the murder of Ahmaud Arbery several weeks ago, and then we're right back to the murder of George Floyd. So of course it's illuminated, but it's not new to Black people. This is not new. This is a historical tragedy, a historical mindset, and a historical poison of racism that has to be dealt with immediately.
How does the church address racism head on? That's for either of you.
I think we need to, Cross, take it, man.
No, okay. We have to have real conversation. We have to have transparent conversations.
What is
Black
that?
churches in the urban.
Say that, Cross.
Well, it means that Black churches in the urban inner city needs to have dialogue with white churches that are in suburban areas. We need to have transparent conversations, like Nick said, first and foremost, about what truly is the gospel. And are we going to talk about the gospel in its totality, or are we going to talk about the gospel as it applies to our lifestyle? Because the gospel, first and foremost, is just so much bigger. It's almost like picking and choosing things from the gospel that you want to condemn people with, or picking and choosing things from the gospel that you want to use to help further your cause. Well, if we're going to talk about the gospel, we need to talk about the totality of Jesus. Yes, how he was a healer, how he was a reconciler, how he brought communities together, and how he had a vision for all of humanity to progress towards salvation. But at the same time, everything about Jesus wasn't roses. He came into the temple turning tables over and calling people out for doing things that were disruptive. And Jesus was about injustice. So I think we just have to deal with the totality of it. I think we can't be afraid, number one, to even say the word racism. I think that whites in America who are Christian born-again believers, they have to ask themselves how they were raised, not just by their immediate family, but historically, in the position under which they have from white privilege and the platform under which they stand on to be able to even practice a stress-free gospel. And I think at the same time, for Black America, we have to do some soul searching as well, and that we can't continue to preach a poor man's gospel of being in need. So we have to come to the table and just be transparent. We have to open our wounds to each other. We have to hear each other out and be willing to accept what we hear and consider it as truth, and then work toward a peaceable solution. And the key term with the church, it has to be peaceful, because when it comes to the secular world, you'll see a lot of rioting and violence and what have you. And that's not to say that these people are not Christians, But it is to say that for those of us who are born again believers, we know that there is a process and a procedure that everything we do in the kingdom must be done with love. And just because we say it's done in love, that doesn't mean that we cannot agree to disagree to move the needle forward so that we all can be together in unity and practice a real gospel for those who are not of the kingdom to see.
Amen. That's powerful. That's powerful. And Nick, I want to ask you this question. Minneapolis is where Pulse Ministries is headquartered. I want to ask, because it's a powerful image when I see the two of you, Black brother, white brother, working together in the aftermath of the protests. You know, what have you guys been seeing there in Minneapolis, and how have you been able to work together to respond to what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's so important, Charlene. When hard times like this happen, it exposes a lot. And one of the things that it exposes is whether or not relationships exist. I think that a lot of people, white or Black or Asian or Hispanic, this isn't just a white and Black issue. Like, this is a humanity. This is an image bearer issue. But I think one of the things that this exposes is that if you don't have friendships and relationships with people who don't look like you, with people who don't come from the same background as you, if your entire worldview is tunnel vision, it's going to be really hard for you to respond and to know how to respond. You're going to make biases that aren't fair because you don't get it. And I just think in Minneapolis, what's happening is that we, Cross, myself, Korey, myself, other leaders, have been working together and have been around a table, listening, learning, disagreeing. It's not always easy. Like, there's a reason that people just have friends like them. It's because it's easier to do that. But that is not the Jesus way. Like, that is not what heaven is not going to be a bunch of white people. It's not going to be a bunch of Black people. It's not going to be a bunch of Asian people. It's going to be all of us, every tribe, tongue, nation. And so we should work towards that where we are. And if where we are doesn't look like that, we should try to change that. And if we can't change it because of proximity, we should try to change it by voices that we're learning under, learning from, listening to. And so what we're seeing in Minneapolis, St. Paul, is that from the tracks of relationship, the church is responding. Because we have a history of loving each other, listening to each other, even being offended by each other. And then, we kind of make up, right? It's like, because that has happened, we can respond. And so the church in the Twin Cities is going to the front lines offering prayer. They're a part of peaceful protests. They're offering food. They're offering tangible solutions. We are trying to shine a spotlight on organizations like the one Korey leads, the Man Up Club, other efforts in the urban core, because this isn't just like a this week issue or next month issue. Right. This is like, no, this is letting us see that we need sustainable, ongoing solutions. And that's going to take the whole church rallying together behind those that maybe aren't your people. Like, that's not your tribe, but you know what? We are a part of the same tribe because it's his tribe. And so that's what's happening. It is beautiful. It is powerful. But man, I just keep telling myself, like, this isn't about a soundbite. This isn't about a post. This isn't about some moment. This has to result in change.
Korey, my last 30 seconds to you. Where do we all go from here? What's next?
From here, we go to action steps because we've already had reaction. We can't just continue to react and be stuck in a state of reaction. We have to be proactive and then go towards action. Action of having real conversations between these murders from a legislation standpoint, changing laws. We need to have people having conversations within their local community, Black and white. Churches need to be getting together to have seminars on racism. Even dealing with racism in school, there's a multiplicity of seminars that can be had so we can educate each other. We have to move forward and be proactive and progressive so that when this comes around again, like Nick said, we won't just all of a sudden have a knee-jerk reaction and try to get together, but we'll already have put some things in place from a sustainable long-term perspective. And the questions won't be asked of how can I help? You'll already know how you can help because we've already been through this before, and then we'll be able to move the needle forward on racism specifically.
Amen.